In the late autumn of 1869, in a quiet corner of New Haven, Connecticut, there stood a modest two-story house belonging to the Morton family. It was here that 9-year-old Caleb Morton began his refusal to sleep. Each night, as the gas lamps were extinguished and the house fell into a deep, profound silence, the boy claimed an old woman would emerge from the shadows. He insisted she did not walk, but crawled, her body moving low to the ground like an insect. His parents, however, saw nothing. To them, the room was empty, the air still, and their son's terror was nothing more than a phantom born of a fevered, childish imagination. If the quiet corners of history whisper to you, and you have only just found this archive, consider subscribing to join our vigil and ensure these records are never lost to the dark. The year was drawing to a close, a season of crisp air and the pervasive, comforting scent of coal smoke hanging over the city of New Haven. Life within the Morton household was, by all accounts, an exercise in predictable tranquility. The father, Elias Morton, was a man whose days were spent in the meticulous and demanding world of clockmaking. His hands, though stained with oil and marked by the fine tools of his trade, were gentle in their domestic application. He would return home each evening as the sun bled its final light across the horizon, his presence announced not by a sound, but by the subtle shift in the atmosphere of the house. A quiet settling that signaled the family unit was once more complete. He was a man of logic, of gears and springs, a firm believer that for every effect there was a discernible and mechanical cause. His world was one of order, and he found immense comfort in its predictability. The idea that something could exist without a rational explanation was not simply foreign to him. It was an affront to the very principles by which he lived and worked. The mother, Margaret Morton, was the heart of this small domestic world. Her life was circumscribed by the walls of the house, yet within them she cultivated a universe of warmth and care. She was a woman of quiet faith and deep maternal instinct, her days a rhythmic cycle of baking, mending, and tending to the needs of her family. Her love for her son, Caleb, was a palpable force in the home. It was in the way she would hum old lullabies while kneading dough, the sound a low, constant reassurance in the background of the day. It was in the careful way she would lay out his clothes, a silent prayer for his health and well-being. She understood her husband's need for a world that made sense, but her own perceptions were more fluid, more attuned to the unseen currents of emotion and intuition. She believed in the power of a soothing hand on a feverish brow, and the ability of a gentle word to ward off the shadows of a bad dream. Her humanizing detail was this profound, almost painful empathy, a trait that would soon be tested beyond all imaginable limits. And then there was Caleb. He was a child born with a delicate constitution, a fact that had colored his 9 years of life with a certain indoor pallor. He was not robust like the other boys in the neighborhood who played boisterously in the streets until called in for supper. Instead, Caleb's world was one of books, of intricate drawings of fantastical creatures, and of long hours spent observing the world from his bedroom window. He was a quiet, observant child, with large, dark eyes that seemed to absorb the light and reflect a profound, almost unnerving seriousness. His parents treated his fragility with a mixture of concern and tenderness, a constant, low-level anxiety that manifested in extra blankets on cold nights and worried glances if he coughed more than twice. The domestic peace of the Morton household was a carefully constructed fortress built to protect this one precious, vulnerable life. The evenings were the most peaceful time. Supper would be a simple affair, followed by Elias reading aloud from a book, his voice a steady, grounding presence in the parlor. The light from the gas lamp would cast a warm, golden glow on the room, making the familiar space feel safe, enclosed, and utterly impervious to the encroaching darkness outside. It was a world of absolute and unwavering normalcy. The first disturbance arrived without fanfare, a subtle crack in the smooth facade of their lives. It began one Tuesday in late October. Caleb had been put to bed in his second-floor room, the small chamber at the end of the hall. It was a child's room, decorated with simple wooden furniture and papered in a pale, repeating floral pattern. The mother had tucked him in, kissed his forehead, and left a single candle burning on the nightstand, its flame a tiny, flickering ward against the darkness. For years, this ritual had been enough. But on this night, less than an hour after the house had settled into its customary quiet, a cry shattered the silence. It was not the usual whimper of a child stirring from a bad dream, but a thin, sharp shriek of genuine terror. The mother was the first to reach his door, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She found her son sitting bolt upright in his bed, his small body trembling violently, his eyes fixed on the far corner of the room, a space cloaked in the deep, shifting shadows cast by the candle flame. When his father arrived moments later, they saw a child they did not recognize. His face was ashen, his breathing ragged and shallow. He pointed a trembling finger toward the corner, his knuckles white. The parents followed his gaze, their eyes straining to penetrate the gloom. They saw nothing. There was only the old rocking chair, a familiar silhouette, and the floral wallpaper, its pattern seeming to ripple and sway in the unsteady candlelight. The father, ever the voice of reason, moved immediately to the corner, his hand sweeping through the empty air. He tapped the walls, confirming their solidity. He spoke to his son in a low, calming tone, assuring him that it was only a dream, a trick of the light, a shadow thrown by the branches of the great sycamore tree that grew just outside the window. He told Caleb he had been dreaming, and that the dream had felt very real, as dreams sometimes do. But Caleb was inconsolable. Through gasping sobs, he tried to explain what he had seen. The narrator must convey his words, his reported speech carrying the weight of his terror. He said it was a woman, an old woman. He said she did not come through the door or the window. She had simply been there, in the corner, as if she had coalesced from the shadows themselves. He said her clothes were dark and ragged, and that long gray hair fell across her face, obscuring her features. But it was not her appearance that had terrified him the most. It was the way she moved. He said she did not stand. She crawled. He described a horrifying, unnatural posture, her body low to the floor, her limbs moving with a scuttling, spider-like motion. He said she had crawled from the corner, her head turned toward his bed, and he could hear the faint, dry rustle of her clothes against the wooden floorboards. He claimed her hands were like claws, the fingers unnaturally long and bent. He had screamed, and she had vanished, dissolving back into the shadows as quickly as she had appeared. The mother held him, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach, a fear born not of what he had seen, but of the sheer, unshakable conviction in his voice. She tried to soothe him, murmuring that it was a terrible nightmare, nothing more. But her words felt hollow, a weak defense against the primal terror that radiated from her son. The father, meanwhile, conducted a thorough search of the room. He checked under the bed. He opened the small wardrobe. He confirmed the window was latched securely from the inside. He found nothing. No sign of entry, no misplaced object, no evidence of any presence other than their own. He lit another lamp, flooding the room with a bright, steady light that banished every shadow. The corner was just a corner. The wallpaper was just wallpaper, its floral pattern now inert and unremarkable. The room was safe. He announced this with a certainty he did not entirely feel. His declaration meant more for his wife and himself than for the terrified child in her arms. That night, Caleb refused to be left alone. He was eventually moved to a cot at the foot of his parents' bed, where he fell into a fitful, shallow sleep, his small body twitching at the slightest sound. For Elias and Margaret Morton, sleep did not come at all. They lay in the darkness, listening to the anxious rhythm of their son's breathing, the familiar peace of their home shattered. The father's mind worked furiously, cycling through logical explanations. A fever dream, a story Caleb had read, a shadow puppet show created by the flickering candle and the swaying tree branch. He clung to these rationales, repeating them to his wife in hushed tones, his words a desperate attempt to rebuild the logical framework of his world. The mother listened, wanting to believe him, but the image of her son's face, the pure, undiluted horror in his eyes, was a powerful counter-argument. She could not so easily dismiss something that had felt so profoundly real to her child. Was it possible for a dream to leave such a deep and lasting wound? The following day, a fragile semblance of normality returned. In the bright, unforgiving light of morning, Caleb's story seemed less plausible, more like the fantastical fabrication of an imaginative child. He was quiet and withdrawn, his usual playful energy replaced by a weary watchfulness. He would cast quick, nervous glances into dark corners and doorways, his body tensing at the sound of a creaking floorboard. The parents agreed to treat the incident as a singular, isolated event, a night terror of unusual intensity. They hoped that by not dwelling on it, by not giving it power, the memory would fade and the fear would recede. But when evening came again, the terror returned. As the mother began the bedtime ritual, Caleb began to weep. He begged her not to leave him alone. He said he was afraid she would come back. He spoke of the crawling woman as if she were a known and recurring threat, an established fact of his nocturnal life. His refusal to sleep became a battle of wills. No amount of reassurance or logical argument could persuade him to stay in his room alone. The parents took turns sitting with him, holding his hand until his exhausted body finally succumbed to a troubled sleep. But the episodes continued. Every few nights, he would wake with the same terrified cry, pointing to the same corner of the room, recounting the same horrifying details of the crawling woman. His health, already so delicate, began to visibly decline. Dark circles formed under his eyes, giving his face a bruised, haunted look. He lost his appetite. His already thin frame grew even more gaunt. The parents' initial dismissal hardened into a more persistent, more worried denial. To accept his story as true was to accept madness into their home, to admit that the world was not the orderly, predictable place they believed it to be. It was easier, safer, to believe their son was ill. After 2 weeks of these escalating nocturnal disturbances, the father made a decision. It was clear that this was no longer a matter of simple childhood fears. It was a medical issue, a sickness of the mind or the nerves, and it required professional intervention. He sent a message to Dr. Whitmore, the family physician. Dr. Whitmore was a man in his late 50s, a respected figure in the community, whose reputation was built on a foundation of scientific reason and calm, dispassionate analysis. His arrival at the Morton home was like the arrival of the cavalry. He carried a worn leather bag that smelled of antiseptic and carbolic soap, and his presence alone seemed to lower the temperature of the household's anxiety. He was a kind man, but his kindness was filtered through a lens of clinical detachment. He listened patiently as the parents recounted the events of the past weeks, his expression betraying no hint of surprise or alarm. He nodded, made a few brief notes in a small ledger, and asked questions about Caleb's diet, his recent activities, and any history of nervous afflictions in the family. His examination of Caleb was gentle but thorough. He checked the boy's pulse and respiration. He used a small ophthalmoscope to look into his eyes, searching for any sign of neurological distress. He found Caleb to be physically weak from lack of sleep and poor nutrition, but otherwise, he could identify no underlying pathology. The boy was listless and afraid, but his answers to the doctor's questions were coherent. When asked about the woman, Caleb repeated his story in a low, flat voice, the details unwavering. He did not embellish. He did not hesitate. He simply stated what he had seen, as if reporting a verifiable fact. The doctor listened to the entire account without interruption. Then, turning to the anxious parents, he delivered his diagnosis. He told them that Caleb was suffering from a condition known as pavor nocturnus, or night terrors. He explained that it was a disorder of arousal, occurring during the transition from the deepest stage of sleep. He assured them that the visions were not real, but were hallucinations, vivid and terrifying dreams from which the boy was not fully awake. The doctor explained that these episodes were common in children with sensitive dispositions and overactive imaginations. He spoke of the brain as a complex machine and said that sometimes its gears could slip, creating phantom images and sensations that felt utterly real to the sufferer. He said the crawling woman was a manifestation of some unarticulated anxiety, a figment of a mind under duress. The parents clung to his words, to the Latin terminology and the confident, scientific explanations. It was a lifeline, a return to the world of reason. Their son was not haunted. He was unwell. There was a name for his condition. It could be understood. It could be managed. The relief in the room was immense, a collective exhalation of breath they had not realized they were holding. The doctor prescribed a simple course of action: a calming tonic of bromide before bed, a diet rich in nutrients to build up his strength, and a strict avoidance of any frightening stories or imagery. But he had one final, crucial recommendation. He suggested they begin keeping a diary, a sleep diary. He presented it as a tool of observation, a way to collect data. He instructed the mother to record everything: the time Caleb fell asleep, the time he woke, the duration and intensity of his episodes, and a verbatim account of anything he said. The doctor framed this as a way to demystify the events, to track them as one would track a fever, and in doing so, to rob them of their power. By documenting the terrors, they would transform them from a monstrous, unknown threat into a predictable, clinical symptom. This act of recording, this turn toward scientific observation, was intended to be the first step toward healing. It was meant to bring the sterile light of reason into the shadowed corners of Caleb Morton's room. But what it would ultimately document was not the slow retreat of a childhood malady, but the methodical, evidentiary advance of something else entirely. The family's faith in medicine was about to be pitted against a presence that obeyed no natural laws, and the first entries in the diary would mark the formal beginning of a case file on the impossible. The sleep diary began as an instrument of reason, a bulwark of empirical data against the rising tide of hysteria. The mother's hand, though trembling slightly, recorded the first entries with a dutiful precision. She noted the exact time Caleb was given the bromide tonic, the quality of his breathing as he drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep, and the profound silence that followed. For 2 nights, the house remained quiet. The tonic seemed to work, pulling the boy down into a heavy, dreamless state from which he did not stir. A fragile hope began to bloom in the sterile lines of the journal, but on the 3rd night, the screaming returned, more piercing and desperate than before. The entry for that night, penned in the pre-dawn hours, was nearly illegible, the ink smudged by what could only have been tears. The mother wrote that Caleb had woken thrashing, his eyes wide with a familiar terror, and had spoken of the woman's hands, claiming they were cold, so terribly cold. Dr. Whitmore reviewed the diary the following morning. He sat in the Mortons' parlor, the small book open on his knee, his expression a mask of professional concentration. The parents watched him, their faces etched with exhaustion and renewed fear. The failure of the bromide was a significant blow to the doctor's initial hypothesis. A simple night terror should have been suppressed by the sedative. The persistence of the vision suggested a more deeply rooted psychological disturbance. He explained to the Mortons that a more direct course of observation was now necessary. He proposed to spend the night in Caleb's room himself. He would sit vigil, observe the boy's sleep patterns firsthand, and document the full cycle of the phenomenon. This was not an admission of defeat, he assured them, but the next logical step in a thorough scientific inquiry. He would be the objective witness, the dispassionate observer whose clinical gaze would surely expose the mundane truth behind the boy's fantastical claims. The father readily agreed, relieved to be handing over the responsibility to a man of science. The mother consented with a quiet nod, though her eyes betrayed a deeper apprehension, a fear that what the doctor might witness would not bring clarity, but a more profound and terrifying confusion. That evening, Dr. Whitmore transformed the child's bedroom into a makeshift laboratory. He arrived not with his medical bag, but with a small crate of equipment. He placed a large, new oil lamp on the bureau, one with a wide, polished reflector designed to cast a broad, steady field of light, powerful enough to hold even the deepest shadows at bay. He had brought his own chair, a sturdy, straight-backed wooden seat that would offer no temptation for sleep. He placed it in the corner opposite the one Caleb had identified as the source of the visitations, affording him a clear and unobstructed view of the entire room, including the bed, the door, and the window. He brought with him a meteorological thermometer, which he hung from a nail on the wall, and his own pocket watch, which he laid face up on the small table beside him. And, of course, he brought his journal and a freshly sharpened pencil. He was preparing not for a haunting, but for an experiment. His demeanor was calm, methodical, the practiced composure of a man who believed utterly in the power of observation to dispel all forms of ignorance and fear. The parents brought Caleb into the room. The boy was pale and listless, his small form swallowed by a voluminous nightshirt. He looked at the doctor, then at the bright lamp, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a faint, childish curiosity. The doctor spoke to him in a low, reassuring voice, explaining that he would be staying in the room tonight just to watch over him. He said they were going to work together to understand the bad dreams. Caleb did not respond, but allowed his mother to tuck him into bed. As she leaned down to kiss him, he whispered something to her, his voice too low for the doctor to hear. The mother's face tightened for a moment before she forced a thin smile, wished her son a peaceful sleep, and retreated from the room with her husband, closing the door softly behind them. The doctor was now alone with the boy. The experiment had begun. For the first hour, there was only the sound of the house settling, the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall below, the groan of timber contracting in the autumn chill, and the faint, whispery hiss of the oil lamp. Dr. Whitmore sat perfectly still in his chair, his senses alert. He made his first entry in the journal. 9 o'clock. Subject is in bed. Appears calm but fatigued. Respiration is normal. The lamp functions perfectly, illuminating all corners of the room. There are no unaccountable shadows. He was establishing a baseline, a portrait of absolute normalcy. He felt a quiet confidence, a certainty that the night would pass without incident, proving that the presence of a calm, authoritative adult was all that was needed to soothe the boy's overactive psyche. Caleb lay still in his bed, his eyes closed, but the doctor noted the tension in his small body, the way his hands were clenched into tight fists atop the covers. He was not asleep. He was waiting. Another hour passed. The doctor recorded the time and the continued stillness. He found his mind drifting, thinking of the articles he was reading in a medical journal from London of a new theory concerning the nervous system. This case, he mused, would make for an interesting paper someday. A classic example of juvenile hysteria, a textbook case of a phantasmagorical obsession. He felt a pang of sympathy for the boy, a child so consumed by his own creations. At precisely 10:37, he observed a change. The tension in Caleb's body seemed to release all at once. His fists unclenched, and his breathing deepened into the slow, regular rhythm of sleep. The doctor made a note. Subject has entered sleep, appears to be in a state of rest. He allowed himself a small, internal sigh of satisfaction. Perhaps the night would be uneventful after all. The quiet held for nearly 20 minutes. Then, the doctor witnessed the first anomaly. Caleb began to murmur in his sleep. It was not the incoherent mumbling of a typical dreamer. It was quiet but distinct, the cadence less like a monologue and more like a conversation. The doctor leaned forward, straining to hear the words. The boy's whispers were fragmented, disjointed phrases spoken into the empty air. He heard the word, "No." Then, a moment later, "Leave it." He whispered a name, but it was not one the doctor recognized, a strange, guttural name that seemed to catch in the boy's throat. Then came a series of whispers that sent a prickle of unease across the doctor's skin. He recorded them verbatim in his journal. He said, "It is not for you." He said, "She is not here." He seemed to be pleading with an unseen presence, a party to a dialogue only he could perceive. His face, even in sleep, was a mask of concentration and distress. Sweat beaded on his upper lip, glistening in the lamplight. His eyelids fluttered rapidly, as if he were watching something move back and forth before him. It was at this point that Dr. Whitmore became aware of a distinct change in the room's atmosphere. A coldness had begun to seep into the air. It was a profound, penetrating chill that had nothing to do with the autumn night outside. He could feel it on the exposed skin of his hands and face, a damp, cellar-like cold. He looked at the thermometer on the wall. Its silver line of mercury had been steady at 68 degrees Fahrenheit since he had arrived. He watched, his eyes narrowing, as the line began to visibly shrink. Within the space of 5 minutes, the temperature in the room dropped a full 10 degrees. He stood and walked to the window, his movements slow and deliberate. He ran his hand along the frame, searching for a draft. There was none. The window was securely latched, its seal tight. He checked the door. It was closed, with no discernible airflow from the hallway. He returned to his chair, his mind racing to find a rational explanation. A sudden downdraft in the chimney, perhaps? A peculiar atmospheric pressure shift? He recorded the temperature drop in his journal, adding a question mark beside the notation. He had barely sat down when the second anomaly occurred. He heard a sound, a faint, rhythmic scratching. It seemed to be coming from directly beneath the floorboards under Caleb's bed. His first thought was of rodents, a mouse or a rat trapped in the walls or the crawl space. It was an old house, after all. Such things were to be expected. He listened intently, trying to isolate the sound, but there was something deeply unsettling about its quality. It was not the frantic, irregular scrabbling of a trapped animal. It was slow, deliberate, and methodical. Scratch, pause, scratch, pause. It had a dreadful, measured cadence. As he continued to listen, a far more disturbing realization began to dawn on him. He looked from the source of the sound to the sleeping boy in the bed. Caleb's chest was rising and falling in a quick, agitated rhythm. The doctor, with his trained medical senses, could almost feel the boy's racing pulse, and the scratching from beneath the floor seemed to be perfectly, impossibly synchronized with that frantic, terrified heartbeat. The doctor's own heart began to beat a little faster. He was a man of science, a man who dealt in the tangible and the observable. But what he was observing made no sense. A temperature drop with no source, whispers to an invisible conversationalist, a scratching sound that kept time with a sleeping boy's pulse. He scanned the room again, his eyes darting from one corner to the next. The lamplight was as bright as ever. Nothing had moved. The rocking chair was still. The wardrobe was closed. And yet, the feeling of a third presence in the room was suddenly, undeniably overwhelming. He felt as if he were being watched. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a static tension that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. He wrote in his journal, his handwriting now noticeably less steady. A significant and unexplained drop in ambient temperature has been recorded. Auditory phenomena have been noted. The subject's physiological state appears to be directly correlated with these external events. He was trying to contain the experience within the safe, sterile language of science, but the words felt like a flimsy shield against the encroaching dread. The scratching stopped. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was somehow more menacing. Caleb fell quiet, his breathing becoming shallow, almost inaudible. The doctor held his own breath, waiting. For a full minute, the room was as still as a tomb. Then, Caleb's body went rigid, his back arched, and a low, guttural moan escaped his lips. His eyes, still closed, rolled back in his head. Dr. Whitmore rose from his chair, ready to intervene, believing the boy was having some kind of seizure. But before he could take a step, the boy's body relaxed, and he fell back against the pillows, limp and seemingly lifeless. The doctor rushed to the bedside, his professional instincts taking over. He felt for a pulse. It was faint and thready, but it was there. The boy was breathing, but just barely. As the doctor stood over him, a new and more horrifying observation presented itself. He could see, there on the pillow beside Caleb's head, several long, dark strands of hair. They were not the boy's fine, brown hair. They were coarse, gray, and unnaturally long. A cold wave of disbelief washed over the doctor. He had been in the room the entire time. No one had entered or left. The window was locked. Yet here was physical evidence of something. He carefully picked up one of the hairs, holding it up to the lamplight. It was wiry and brittle, like the hair of a very old woman. His scientific mind reeled, grasping for a plausible explanation. Could they have come from the mother earlier in the evening? Perhaps from a shawl or a coat? But he had watched her leave. She had not lingered over the pillow, and even if she had, it did not explain the other phenomena. It did not explain the cold, or the whispers, or the dreadful, rhythmic scratching. He stood there for a long time, the single gray hair resting in the palm of his hand, a tiny, impossible artifact that defied every law of nature he held to be true. His carefully constructed experiment, designed to expose a childish fantasy, had instead yielded evidence of an intruder he could not see, a presence whose physical traces were now coiled on his subject's pillow. He looked around the brightly lit room, at the empty spaces and solid walls. For the first time in his professional life, Dr. Whitmore was forced to confront the chilling possibility that the parents' insistence that nothing was there was, in a way, true. The intruder was not something one could see, but it was there, and it was leaving pieces of itself behind. His search for more evidence would lead him to look under the bed, where he would find not just a few strands, but a small, coiled nest of them, tucked away in the darkness beneath the bed frame, as if a creature had been sleeping there for a very, very long time. The foundation of his rational world had not just cracked, it had begun to crumble. Dr. Whitmore departed the Morton house just as the first gray, anemic light of dawn began to stain the eastern sky. He left without offering any new diagnosis, any comforting scientific platitudes. In his place, he left a profound and chilling silence. He had taken the coiled black hairs with him, tucked carefully within a glassine envelope in his medical bag, a piece of tangible evidence that felt more like a curse than a clue. His parting words to Elias and Margaret Morton were carefully chosen, stripped of all medical certainty. He told them he needed to consult his books. He said the case presented anomalous data that required further study. The clinical detachment had vanished from his voice, replaced by a deep, resonant disquietude that was far more terrifying to the parents than any professional alarm would have been. He had walked into their home a bastion of reason, and he left a man visibly shaken, his faith in an orderly, knowable world fractured by a night spent in a brightly lit room where the impossible had made itself manifest. The mother, Margaret Morton, was now adrift. The anchor of medical science had been wrenched away, leaving her tossed on a sea of primal fear. Her husband retreated into a stony, terrified denial, refusing to speak of what the doctor had witnessed. He spent his days at his workshop, trying to lose himself in the familiar, comforting mechanics of gears and springs, but he could find no solace. The logical world he so desperately needed to believe in was under assault from within his own home. This left the mother alone to confront the growing certainty that what was happening to her son was not a sickness of the mind, but a sickness of the house itself. A desperate, maternal instinct, a primal need to protect her child from an enemy she could not see, began to drive her. If the affliction was not in her son, then it had to be in his surroundings. The answer, she felt with a bone-deep conviction, lay somewhere within the walls of the house they inhabited. Her search began as a frantic cleaning, a desperate attempt to physically purge the unseen presence from their lives. She scrubbed floors until the wood was pale and raw. She beat the dust from every rug and curtain, watching the motes dance in the shafts of sunlight like tiny, malevolent spirits. She aired out every room, throwing open windows to the crisp autumn wind, as if a strong enough breeze could carry the haunting away. But no matter how much she cleaned, the house retained its oppressive atmosphere, a feeling of being watched, a coldness that had nothing to do with the season. Her quest, born of a mother's fierce and protective love, one of the few humanizing details of her character, led her from the sunlit upper floors down into the darker, forgotten corners of the house. It was this descent that would finally lead her not to an answer, but to a far more terrifying question: the cellar. It was a place she rarely went, a damp, subterranean space that smelled of earth, mildew, and the faint, sweet scent of decay. It was used for storing preserves, old furniture, and the detritus of a life lived by another family, in another time. Armed with a single flickering lantern, she picked her way down the steep wooden steps. The air grew colder, heavier, with each step she took. The lantern cast huge, dancing shadows that seemed to mock her, twisting familiar shapes into monstrous caricatures. The cellar was a labyrinth of forgotten objects. A broken rocking horse stood in one corner, its painted eyes seeming to follow her. A stack of old trunks, bound in leather and brass, sat against a far wall, their contents a mystery. It was in one of these trunks, a small, unassuming wooden chest tucked away beneath a pile of moth-eaten blankets, that she found it. The lock was rusted shut, but with a piece of scrap metal she pried it open. The hinges groaned in protest, the sound unnaturally loud in the tomb-like silence. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed linens and a collection of dried, withered flowers, was a small, leather-bound album. It was a photograph album, its pages thick and brittle with age. With trembling hands, she carried the album back up to the relative light and safety of the kitchen. She laid it on the table, the old leather cool and damp beneath her fingertips. She opened it. The first few pages contained stiff, formal portraits of a family she did not recognize. A stern-faced man with a severe beard, a woman in a high-collared dress, and two solemn-looking children. The previous owners, she presumed. She turned another page, and her breath caught in her throat. There, staring out at her from across the decades, was a single tintype photograph of a woman. She was old, her face a roadmap of deep, unforgiving wrinkles. Her hair was long, dark, and streaked with gray, pulled back severely from her face, but it was her eyes that held the mother's gaze. They were dark and seemed to possess a strange, flat intensity, a look of profound and ancient grievance. And her hands, they were resting in her lap, and even in the primitive, faded image, they looked wrong. The fingers were too long, the knuckles too large, giving them a claw-like, grasping appearance. But the most horrifying detail was a dark, disfiguring birthmark that marred the right side of her face, a blotch that pulled the corner of her mouth down into a permanent, unnerving grimace. A wave of nausea and a dizzying sense of recognition washed over the mother. She knew this face. She had never seen it before, and yet she knew it intimately. She took the photograph to Caleb's room. Her son was awake, sitting listlessly in his bed, his eyes tracing the floral patterns on the wallpaper. He had not spoken a word all morning. The mother approached him slowly, her heart pounding a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. She held out the tintype, her hand shaking so violently that the image blurred. She asked him a single whispered question, a question she was terrified to have answered. She asked if he knew who this was. Caleb's gaze fell upon the photograph. For a moment, he simply stared, his small face a blank canvas. Then, a flicker of recognition, followed by a wave of pure, unadulterated terror. He scrambled backwards in the bed, his body pressing against the headboard as if trying to merge with the wood. He raised a trembling hand and pointed at the image. His voice, when it came, was a choked, rasping whisper. He said that it was her. It was the woman who crawls. The confirmation struck the mother with the force of a physical blow. The haunting was not a product of her son's imagination. It was real. The woman was real. She had a face. She had a history. And that history was somehow tied to this house. The need to understand became an obsession. Leaving her son in the care of a neighbor, she took the photograph and went to the one place in town that held the collective memory of the community, the town archives, housed in the back of the municipal building. There, she sought the help of the town clerk, a dry, meticulous man who knew the history of every family and every property in New Haven. He did not recognize the woman in the photograph, but he recognized the house from the mother's description. He pulled out the old property ledgers, his fingers tracing the lines of spidery, faded script. The house had been built in 1831. The family in the first few photographs of the album had been the original owners. He found their name, and then, in a separate ledger of household staff, he found her. Her name was Elspeth Muir. The ledger listed her profession as a midwife. She had been employed by the original family from 1845 until 1847. There was a single, cryptic notation next to her name, written in a different hand, the ink darker, more urgent. It read, "Dismissed under suspicion." The mother pressed the clerk, her voice tight with a desperate urgency. Suspicion of what? The clerk, his curiosity now piqued, began to cross-reference the dates with the town's records of official inquests. He found it in a dusty, leather-bound volume containing the minutes of the town council from the year 1847. The story that unfolded in the clerk's dry, dispassionate reading was one of tragedy and whispered accusations. In the winter of that year, 2 infants under Elspeth Muir's care had died in their cribs, both within a fortnight of each other. Both deaths had been attributed to natural causes, a sad but not uncommon occurrence in those times. But then, a 3rd infant, the newborn son of the family who owned the house, had fallen gravely ill. The child had been racked with a mysterious fever and a respiratory affliction that the attending physician could not explain. Whispers and rumors had begun to circulate. Stories of the midwife's strange, solitary nature, of her rumored knowledge of folk remedies and dark herbs. Accusations of negligence turned to accusations of something far more sinister. The community, gripped by fear and superstition, turned against her. An official inquest was launched, but no definitive evidence of wrongdoing was ever produced. There was no trial. She was simply dismissed, cast out, her reputation destroyed. The town record stated that she had left New Haven shortly thereafter and was never heard from again. The final chilling detail came from a footnote in the physician's report on the 3rd infant. He had noted peculiar, bruise-like marks on the child's chest, small and circular, almost like the impressions of fingertips. The child, against all odds, had survived, but the midwife had been branded an outcast. The mother sat in the silence of the archives, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place, forming a picture of unimaginable horror. The midwife, Elspeth Muir, a woman accused of harming the very infants she was meant to protect, a woman whose spirit, it seemed, had remained tethered to the site of her greatest shame and sorrow, the house. Why had she returned now? What did she want with Caleb? The answer seemed to hang in the dusty air of the archives, a terrible and unspoken truth. The midwife's rage, her unresolved grief, had festered for 2 decades, and now it had found a new target. A small, vulnerable boy, sleeping in the very room where she had once attended to a newborn. Was this a random haunting, or was it something more personal, more deliberate? Was Caleb simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, or was there something about him that had called to her, that had awakened her dormant fury? She returned home as dusk was falling, the tintype photograph clutched in her hand. The house seemed darker, more menacing than ever before. The ordinary creaks and groans of the old structure now sounded like whispers, like the dry rustle of a crawling thing. That night, she told her husband everything. She showed him the photograph. She recounted the story from the town archives. He listened, his face pale and drawn in the flickering lamplight. For the first time, she saw the rigid walls of his denial begin to crumble, replaced by a raw, primal fear. The evidence was no longer just the fevered ramblings of a sick child. It was a name, a face, a history. The haunting had been given a biography. That night, Caleb did not sleep. He sat in his bed, drawing furiously on a piece of paper with a nub of charcoal. When his mother finally convinced him to show her his work, a cold dread, deeper than any she had yet known, settled in her heart. The drawing was crude, childish, but its subject was unmistakable. It depicted a pair of long, claw-like hands, the fingers bent and grasping, and they were reaching, not for Caleb, but for a small, empty cradle that he had drawn in the corner of the room. The midwife had not returned for her own restitution. She had returned to finish what she had started all those years ago. She had come back for the child. The parents now understood. Their son was not just being haunted, he was being claimed. The revelation in the archives and the chilling confirmation in Caleb's drawing shattered the last vestiges of the Mortons' denial. The abstract terror that had haunted their nights had coalesced into a tangible, historical entity, Elspeth Muir, a name, a face, and a motive that echoed across 2 decades of silent rage. The parents understood now that they were not dealing with a sickness or a delusion. They were engaged in a siege. Their home was the battlefield, their son the prize, and their enemy was a specter fueled by an ancient, unresolved grief. Reason had failed them. Medicine had failed them. All that remained was a primal, desperate instinct to protect their own. They knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that the coming night would be the culmination of their ordeal. The midwife's presence had grown bolder, more assertive, and they could feel the house groaning under the weight of her escalating malevolence. There would be no more sleeping on a cot in another room. There would be no more entrusting their son's safety to a scientific observer. Tonight, they would keep the vigil themselves, two desperate guardians standing between their child and the encroaching darkness. As dusk bled into a bruised purple twilight, a storm began to gather on the horizon. The wind picked up, rattling the window panes in their frames like dry bones. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of rain and ozone. It was as if the weather itself was responding to the charged atmosphere within the house, the external turmoil a mirror of their internal dread. The father, Elias Morton, a man who had always found his strength in the predictable mechanics of the world, now found himself preparing for a battle that had no earthly rules of engagement. He retrieved his service pistol from a locked box in his study. It was a Colt 1851 Navy revolver, a relic from his brief and uneventful time in the state militia. He had never fired it in anger, had only ever used it for target practice on calm Sunday afternoons. The weapon felt heavy and unfamiliar in his hand, a cold, metallic anachronism in a fight against a foe that was not made of flesh and blood. He checked the action, the loud, definitive click of the hammer, a small, defiant sound in the thickening silence. He loaded each of the 6 chambers, the mundane, mechanical process, a desperate ritual to impose some sense of order on the encroaching chaos. His humanizing detail, a quiet pride in his steady hand, was now a grim necessity. He was no longer a clockmaker, he was a sentry. The mother prepared for the night in her own way. Her actions were a flurry of protective, almost superstitious gestures. She lit every lamp and candle she could find, placing them in Caleb's room until the small space was ablaze with a warm, flickering light that seemed to physically push back against the shadows. She brought in a heavy wooden crucifix that normally hung in their own bedroom and placed it on the wall above Caleb's bed. She even sprinkled a line of salt across the threshold of the doorway, an old folk remedy she remembered her own grandmother speaking of, a desperate grasping at any form of protection, no matter how irrational. Their son, Caleb, seemed to have retreated to a place beyond fear. He was quiet, his eyes wide and unfocused, his small body rigid with a terrible, silent anticipation. He knew she was coming. He had stopped fighting it. He was simply waiting for her arrival. The parents took their positions. The mother sat on the edge of Caleb's bed, one hand resting on his small, still form, a physical anchor in the rising storm. The father stood near the door, the heavy pistol held loosely at his side, his gaze fixed on the corner of the room, the space that Caleb's terror had identified as the source, the portal. Outside, the storm broke. Rain began to lash against the windows, driven by a furious wind. A low rumble of thunder vibrated through the floorboards, a deep, guttural growl from the heavens. The house seemed to hold its breath, every creak and groan of the old structure amplified by the tense, expectant silence within the room. For an hour, they waited. The only sounds were the storm outside and the frantic, shallow rhythm of their own breathing. The candlelight danced and swayed, casting their shadows large and distorted against the walls, making the floral wallpaper seem to writhe and crawl. The first sign of the manifestation was not visual. It was auditory. A slow, rhythmic creaking began to emanate from the floorboards in the designated corner. It was not the sound of the house settling. This was a deliberate, localized sound, the sound of a heavy weight being dragged across the wood. Creak, pause, creak, pause. It was the sound of something crawling. Elias Morton raised the pistol, his knuckles white, his arm trembling slightly. He could see nothing, yet the sound was undeniable, a physical violation of the empty space. Then came the cold. It was the same profound, unnatural chill that Dr. Whitmore had documented, but it was far more intense. It poured into the room from that corner like a tide of icy water, extinguishing 2 of the candles on the bureau as if a phantom breath had snuffed them out. The temperature plummeted, and the mother could see her own breath misting in the air. She pulled the blankets tighter around her son, her body a frail, human shield against the encroaching spectral cold. And then they saw it. It was not a sudden appearance, not a ghostly apparition materializing from thin air. It was far more insidious, far more horrifying. The very fabric of reality in that corner of the room seemed to buckle and warp. The light from the remaining lamps began to bend and distort as it passed through that space, as if they were looking through a pane of flawed, rippling glass. The lines of the wallpaper began to twist and flow, the floral patterns melting into a dark, viscous smear. A shape began to resolve itself from this distortion, a low, hunched form coalescing from the shadows and the warped light. It was a deeper black against the darkness, a void in the shape of a human figure. It was low to the ground, its form indistinct but undeniably that of a woman on her hands and knees. They could not see a face, only a tangled mass of long dark hair that hung down, obscuring any features. It was Elspeth Muir, exactly as Caleb had described her, a crawling horror born from the very substance of the room itself. The rhythmic creaking grew louder as the shape began to move, pulling itself forward, out of the corner, and into the center of the room. The sound was a dry, rasping scrape, the sound of old, brittle limbs dragging across the wooden floor. It moved with a dreadful, insect-like deliberation, its progress marked by the rhythmic bending of the floorboards beneath its unseen weight. A low, guttural sound began to fill the room, a dry, rattling moan that seemed to emanate from the shape itself, the sound of a voice unused for decades, a sound of profound and eternal misery. The mother let out a small, strangled cry, her hand flying to her mouth. She could feel Caleb's body beneath her hand, and it was as cold as ice, his breathing so shallow she could no longer detect it. Elias Morton acted on pure, unthinking instinct. He raised the pistol, his hands surprisingly steady now, his terror momentarily burned away by a surge of paternal rage. He aimed directly at the center of the crawling mass and fired. The sound of the gunshot was catastrophic in the small, enclosed space, a deafening explosion of noise and fire. The room filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. The bullet tore through the empty air where the shape had been, shattering a porcelain wash basin on the bureau behind it. For a heart-stopping moment, the crawling form seemed to recoil, to dissolve slightly at its edges, the sound of its moan rising in pitch to a thin, enraged shriek. But it did not vanish. Instead, it seemed to surge forward with a renewed, impossible speed. It was in that moment that Caleb screamed. It was not a scream of fear, but of agony. He arched his back, his small body convulsing violently on the bed. His eyes flew open, but they were not his own. They were wide, black, and utterly devoid of recognition. He screamed a single, horrifying phrase, his child's voice twisted into a coarse, aged rasp that was not his own. He screamed that she was inside. The father, his mind reeling from the impossibility of what was happening, fired again and again. He emptied the revolver into the space, the bullets punching useless holes in the floorboards and the opposite wall, the explosions of gunfire, a futile barrage against an enemy that had no physical form to destroy. As the last shot echoed into silence, the crawling shape on the floor dissipated. It did not fly away or retreat. It simply dissolved, like smoke in the wind, the warped light and distorted shadows snapping back into their proper places. The corner of the room was just a corner again. The oppressive cold began to recede, but the horror was not over. It had simply changed its location. The mother watched in mute, paralyzed terror as her son's convulsions subsided. He collapsed back onto the pillows, his body limp, his face a pale, waxy mask. His eyes were closed now, a faint, bluish tinge coloring his lips. The apparition was gone from the room, but it had left its mark. The father dropped the empty pistol, the metal clattering loudly on the floor. He rushed to the bed, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were telling him. He put his ear to his son's chest, listening for a heartbeat. He could hear nothing. The rhythmic creak of the crawling thing had been replaced by a silence more profound and more terrible than any sound. Outside, a final, brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed by a deafening crack of thunder that shook the very foundations of the house. And then, the storm passed, and all was quiet. The vigil was over. The siege had been lost. The morning would bring a new kind of silence, the silence of grief, of guilt, and of a world forever remade by the crawl of something that should not have been. Dr. Whitmore would be summoned once more, not as an observer of a strange phenomenon, but to perform the final, grim task of documenting its aftermath. The morning after the storm was unnaturally beautiful. The sky was scrubbed clean, a pale, pristine blue, and the rising sun cast long, golden fingers of light across a world washed new by the rain. But inside the Morton house, the light did not bring warmth or comfort. It was a cold, clinical light that illuminated the devastation of the night before, making the scene of the tragedy all the more stark and unbearable. The air in Caleb's room was still thick with the lingering, acrid smell of gunpowder, a scent that clung to the curtains and the bedding like a shroud. The father, Elias Morton, sat in a chair by the window, his gaze fixed on nothing, the now useless revolver resting on the floor beside him. He had not moved or spoken since the apparition had dissipated, his mind a hollow chamber of shock and a grief so profound it had rendered him mute. He was a man whose entire world, a world built on the solid, dependable principles of mechanics and logic, had been systematically dismantled and utterly destroyed in the space of a single night. The mother, Margaret Morton, moved through the house like a ghost in her own life. Her grief had not yet found the release of tears. It was a sharp, physical pain in her chest, a weight that made every breath a conscious and difficult effort. She had performed the final, heartbreaking duties of a mother. She had washed her son's small, still body and dressed him in his finest suit of clothes. She had combed his hair and folded his hands upon his chest. He now lay on his bed, which she had remade with fresh, clean linens, looking not like a child who had been stolen by a malevolent spirit, but like a porcelain doll, perfect and unnervingly still. The house was a tomb, the silence broken only by the relentless, cheerful birdsong from the world outside, a sound that felt like a cruel mockery. It was she who had to summon Dr. Whitmore. She sent a neighbor's boy with a note, the words stark and formal, stripped of all emotion. The doctor arrived within the hour, his face a grim mask of professional solemnity, but his eyes held a flicker of something else, a deep, personal dread. He had been a witness to the prelude, and now he had been called to officiate at its horrific conclusion. He entered Caleb's room and stood for a long moment, looking at the small form on the bed. He saw the bullet holes in the wall, the shattered porcelain of the wash basin, and he understood that the family's desperate, violent struggle had been as real as its outcome was tragic. He spoke to the mother in a low, gentle voice, asking the necessary questions, his tone carefully neutral. She answered him in a flat monotone, recounting the events of the night with a strange, detached clarity, as if she were describing a scene from a book she had once read. She spoke of the crawling shape, the drop in temperature, the sound, and her son's final, terrible cry. The doctor listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When she was finished, he performed his examination. It was a formality, of course, but it was a necessary one. He confirmed what they all knew. Caleb Morton was gone. The official cause of death, he explained, would have to be recorded as cardiac failure, brought on by the stress of a prolonged febrile illness and a severe night terror episode. It was a lie, a thin veneer of medical respectability papered over an impossible truth, but it was a necessary fiction to protect the family from the kind of scrutiny and suspicion that had destroyed Elspeth Muir 2 decades earlier. The world of 1869 had no place for a story of crawling phantoms and spectral assaults. He promised to handle the death certificate and the necessary arrangements with the undertaker. But for his own peace of mind, for the sake of the scientific rationalism that had been so profoundly shaken, he felt compelled to perform one final investigation. With the parents' numb, unspoken consent, he conducted a more thorough, private examination of the body, an autopsy. In the cold, morning light of the bedroom, he made his final, horrifying discovery. Externally, there were no marks on the boy's body, save for the faint, bluish tint of his skin. But when he examined the boy's chest, pressing gently on the ribcage, he felt a subtle, unnatural give. His internal findings were what would haunt him for the rest of his days. He found significant bruising, not on the skin, but deep within the tissue, surrounding the lungs and the heart. The pattern of the bruising was unmistakable. It was the distinct, circular impression of fingertips, small and numerous, as if a pair of impossibly strong hands had reached inside the boy's chest and squeezed, crushing the life from him with a direct, physical pressure. It was the same anomalous detail that had been noted in the physician's report on the infant who had survived Elspeth Muir's care all those years ago. It was her signature. Dr. Whitmore recorded his findings not in an official report, but in his own private journal, the same one in which he had documented the night of his vigil. His entry for that day was a testament to his shattered worldview. He wrote that the physical evidence was medically inexplicable and defied all known principles of pathology. He wrote of a force that could manifest physically, that could exert pressure and leave marks, yet remained unseen. His rational mind, in its final act of desperation, tried to contain the horror in the language of science, speculating about a form of atmospheric pressure or a bioelectrical field. But the words were hollow. He concluded the entry with a single, unscientific sentence, a confession of his own profound and terrifying uncertainty. He wrote, "I cannot explain what has happened here, but I know that the boy did not die of a fright. He was killed." The doctor's despair was not just for the lost child, but for the loss of a world he understood. In the days that followed, the Morton house became a place of profound and suffocating silence. The funeral was a small, somber affair, attended by a few neighbors who spoke in hushed, sympathetic tones about the tragedy of a frail child succumbing to a long illness. The story of the crawling woman remained a secret, a shared trauma locked away within the surviving family, but the haunting was not over. Its primary objective had been achieved, but its presence lingered, a residual stain on the atmosphere of the house. The mother, Margaret Morton, was the one who felt it most acutely. She began to hear things, whispers, faint, dry, sibilant sounds that seemed to come from within the walls, from the chimney, from the empty spaces beneath the floorboards. She would hear them at night, when her husband had finally fallen into an exhausted, alcohol-induced sleep. She could never make out the words, but the tone was one of gloating, of a satisfied, malevolent hunger. Her final entry in the sleep diary, the journal that had begun as an instrument of reason, was a testament to her complete spiritual collapse. She did not write about her grief or her sorrow. She wrote about the whispers. She wrote, "He is gone, but she is not. I hear her in the chimney. She is speaking his name." The entry was dated 3 days after the funeral. After that, she never wrote in the diary again. The house that had once been her sanctuary had become her prison, a place where she was tormented by the lingering echo of the entity that had murdered her son. Within a month, the Mortons were gone. They sold the house and all its contents for a pittance to a speculator, packed a single trunk, and left New Haven. They vanished from the town records as completely as Elspeth Muir had 2 decades before, 2 more victims of a haunting that consumed not just lives, but entire families. They left everything behind, as if trying to shed the skin of their former lives. They left the furniture, the dishes, and the father's intricate, half-finished clocks. And on the bedside table in the small second-floor bedroom, they left the diary. It lay there, a slim leather-bound volume containing the complete, methodical record of a family's descent into an abyss of supernatural horror. It was a testament to both their initial belief in reason and their ultimate devastating confrontation with the unreasonable. The house stood vacant for a time, its windows dark and empty, like the eyes of a skull. The neighbors whispered about the tragedy of the Mortons, but the true story remained untold, locked away in the silent rooms. The diary waited, a patient, silent witness on the bedside table. It waited for the house to be occupied again, for a new family to arrive, for the cycle of disbelief and discovery to begin once more. The physical evidence of the haunting, the bruises shaped like fingerprints, might have faded with the boy's body, but its official record, its scientific and emotional documentation, remained. A ticking bomb of memory left in the heart of the house, waiting for the right hand to open its pages and give the story a new voice. For 20 years, the house on the quiet corner of New Haven remained a place of shadows and whispers, a silent monument to a tragedy the town had chosen to forget. It passed through the hands of several owners, speculators who rented it out to a string of transient tenants. No one stayed for long. Families would move in, drawn by the low rent, but would invariably leave within a season or 2, complaining of a persistent, unshakable chill in the upstairs rooms, of strange drafts, and a pervasive feeling of being watched. The stories were dismissed as the usual grumblings of tenants in an old, poorly maintained property. The core of the horror, the true history of the house, lay dormant, sealed within the pages of the diary that still rested, untouched and gathering dust, on the nightstand in the small bedroom at the end of the hall. The house was waiting. The presence within it was patient. It had claimed one child, and it was content to lie in silent hibernation, its hunger sated, until the right conditions presented themselves once more. In the spring of 1889, 2 full decades after the death of Caleb Morton, those conditions arrived. A new family, the Cartwrights, purchased the house. They were newcomers to New Haven, a young couple with a single child, a boy of 7 named Samuel. They were unaware of the house's history and saw only a charming, if slightly neglected, home that they could afford. The father was a clerk at the university, a man of modest ambition and a gentle disposition. The mother was a woman full of hopeful energy, eager to create a warm and loving home for her family. And their son, Samuel, was a bright, curious boy with a mop of blonde hair and a constitution far more robust than Caleb Morton's had ever been. They were the perfect picture of innocent, unsuspecting life, moving into a space that had been hollowed out by a profound and lasting sorrow. They spent the first few weeks in a flurry of domestic activity, airing out the musty rooms, patching plaster, and applying fresh coats of paint. The mother, in her efforts to scrub away the years of neglect, found the old diary. She picked it up, blew a cloud of dust from its cover, and idly flipped through the pages. She saw the neat, precise entries, the charts of sleep patterns, and the increasingly frantic scrawl. She read a few passages, her brow furrowed in a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. She assumed it was the journal of a previous tenant, the sad record of a mother dealing with a sickly, imaginative child. She found the story of the crawling woman to be a morbid, gothic fantasy, the kind of thing a child might invent. With a sympathetic shake of her head, she placed the diary in the bottom of a trunk with other abandoned belongings she had found, intending to dispose of it later. She dismissed the contents as a relic of a past that had no bearing on her own bright future in this house. The warning, so clearly and methodically laid out, was read, misunderstood, and ultimately ignored. For the first few months, life in the house was peaceful. The Cartwrights were happy. Young Samuel loved his new room, the same small bedroom at the end of the hall. He spent hours there, playing with his tin soldiers and wooden toys, his cheerful laughter echoing in a space that had for so long been defined by silence and fear. The parents saw the house not as a place of lingering tragedy, but as a place of new beginnings. The chill in the upstairs rooms was still present, but they attributed it to poor insulation. The occasional unexplained noise was simply the settling of an old house. They, like the Mortons before them, found rational explanations for every small anomaly, their contentment a powerful shield against the subtle, encroaching dread. The shield held until a night in late October, almost exactly 20 years to the day from when Caleb Morton had first cried out in terror. The mother was woken from a deep sleep by a sound from her son's room. It was not a scream, but a low, conversational murmur. Thinking he was simply talking in his sleep, she got out of bed and went to his door, pushing it open a crack. The room was dark, save for the pale sliver of moonlight filtering through the window. She could see her son's small form sitting up in his bed. He was not talking to himself. He was speaking to the far corner of the room, the same corner that had been the focal point of Caleb's terror. Her blood ran cold as she listened to his words. He was whispering, his voice calm, almost curious. He said, "Your hands are funny." Then, after a short pause, as if listening to a reply, he asked a question that shattered the mother's world. He asked, "Why do you crawl?" The mother stood frozen in the hallway, her hand clamped over her mouth to stifle a scream. The words from the diary, which she had dismissed as morbid fantasy, came flooding back to her. The crawling woman. It was not a child's invention. It was real, and it was in her son's room, now. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She burst into the room, flipping the switch for the new electric lamp that her husband had recently installed. The room was flooded with a harsh, instantaneous light. Her son sat blinking in the sudden brightness, a look of confusion on his face. The corner of the room was empty. There was nothing there. She rushed to her son, grabbing him, her hands shaking. She asked him who he was talking to. Samuel, now fully awake and frightened by his mother's panic, simply said that a nice old lady had been visiting him. He said she had told him she used to live here a long, long time ago. That night, the boy slept in his parents' bed. The next day, the frantic mother retrieved the diary from the trunk. She read it from beginning to end, her horror growing with each page. She read of the escalating terror, of Dr. Whitmore's vigil, of the temperature drops and the black hairs, of the final, catastrophic confrontation. The story the diary told was no longer a sad, historical curiosity. It was a direct and imminent threat to her own child. She showed the diary to her husband. He read it, his initial skepticism slowly giving way to a dawning, horrified belief as he recognized the parallels to what they had just experienced. The cycle was beginning again. The entity in the house had awakened from its long slumber, drawn to the presence of a new child. Their fear was compounded by another discovery. While searching for information about the house's past, the father came into contact with a local historical society. He mentioned the name he had seen in the diary, Dr. Whitmore. An elderly member of the society remembered the doctor. He said Whitmore had become a strange, reclusive figure in his later years. He had largely abandoned his medical practice and had become obsessed with what he called unexplained environmental phenomena. He had spent the last decade of his life compiling research, collecting stories of hauntings and strange occurrences from all over the state. The historian mentioned that the doctor's personal journals had been donated to the society upon his death just a few years prior. He offered to let the father see them. At the historical society, a new, final piece of the puzzle was unearthed. The father was given a stack of Dr. Whitmore's journals, filled with his cramped, spidery handwriting. He found the entries detailing his time with the Morton family, his account of the vigil corroborating the mother's diary perfectly. He read of the autopsy, of the fingerprint-shaped bruises that had been the true cause of Caleb's death. But it was the doctor's final entry, written on a date years later, that provided the most chilling conclusion. The entry was about the Morton house. Whitmore wrote that he had come to believe that the entity, the spirit of Elspeth Muir, was not merely a residual haunting, but a predatory, intelligent consciousness, inextricably bound to the property. He theorized that it lay dormant, feeding on the residual emotional energy of the location, until the presence of a vulnerable child acted as a catalyst, awakening its hunger. He believed the entity learned from each encounter, that its manifestations were a form of communication, a testing of the boundaries of belief. The final sentence of the journal was a frantic, unfinished thought, as if the doctor had been interrupted or had been struck by a thought so terrifying he could not bring himself to write it down. He wrote, "The true danger is not in seeing the woman. The danger is in the moment one ceases to disbelieve. It is belief that opens the door, and once opened, the sentence was never finished." The father returned home, the doctor's final, terrifying warning echoing in his mind. He and his wife now knew the full, horrifying truth. They understood that their son's innocent, unafraid conversation with the nice old lady was not a prelude to the haunting, but the end of its first phase. The entity had found a child who was not afraid, a child who believed in her, and that belief had opened the door. They knew they could not fight this thing. The Mortons had tried, with faith and with violence, and it had destroyed them. There was only one choice. That very night, the Cartwrights packed a few essential belongings. They did not wait for morning. They abandoned the house and everything in it, fleeing into the darkness. They left the lights on, a small, futile ward against a presence that light could not touch. As they hurried away down the street, the father glanced back at the house. He could see the light on in his son's bedroom window, and for a fleeting, heart-stopping second, he thought he saw a dark shape silhouetted against the curtain, a low, hunched figure, as if someone were on their hands and knees, looking out, watching them go. The house was quiet once more, the cycle interrupted, but not broken. The presence was still there. It had been awakened, and it was patient. It would wait. It would wait for the next family, the next child, the next opportunity to complete the conversation, to crawl out of the corner and to finish the story that had begun so long ago with the first terrified cry of a boy who refused to sleep. The case file on Caleb Morton is now closed. Subscribe to the Blasphemy Archive to stand among those present when the next is opened, and leave your thoughts on what you have witnessed.